Okay, let's be honest here. I'm as tired as most of you are right now, so we're going to make this quick and kind of dive through this. Why did the United States reject the Treaty of Versailles? This question, when you have a why question, you really need to be able to dive into the many different reasons. So why is asking you to cover all the possibilities. You do not have to group everything as ideological or political. You don't have to go just purely by those two ideas. You can break down and say, well, why is because they disagreed over this, and this. Why is because there was many petty differences, and you can go through the differences, and then you can group them towards the end. You could dive into the end and say basically the many differences they had on the treaty outweighed the ways that they went, the ways that the ideas outweighed the political differences. I would focus on the final vote as a way of maybe even starting this out, as a way of really diving into Wilson, reject the amended treaty. You could look at Lodge's actions, the irreconcilables, and go at it that way as well. There's just a lot of different ways you can attack this question, so you don't have to pigeonhole yourself as just doing the however statement with the two ideas. You could talk about the isolationist tradition as a reason. That's something we haven't necessarily fully talked about, or something that was brought up a lot today, but that is something that Link brought up in his argument, that it was partisanship that led to it, but he also said it wasn't just partisanship. It was this idea of isolationism, and really the League of Nations goes right against that tradition. And it's not just like a slow change from that tradition. It is a 180 turn away from the isolationist tradition in the United States. And how much did the irreconcilables play off that fear of Americans? How much did they use this? And also looking at the treaty, did Europe change? No. They're still going after land, they're still going after money, they're still going after colonies. And so Europe kind of proved to be the same nation that it's always been. And so maybe that convinced people and the senators that it was time to move away. But either way, you could attack it with a however statement with the two major ones. You could attack it with if-thens. Or you can say that, or kind of attack it more. And if you don't want to use if-then, you could just use analytical statements. You don't have to have a set argument. You can just point out things that need to be examined. But what you want to make sure you don't do is, there was lots of different reasons. There was political reasons, ideological reasons, and there were other reasons. And they all led to the failure of the treaty. Because there you're just saying that everything that happened led to the treaty. And then you tend to overgeneralize and say, well, this led to the failure, this led to the failure. Because remember, one of the things that we're really focused on this time is being exact in your language. This led to the failure because, and really being specific with how it led to the failure. And one way to do that is also to point out, well, this piece of evidence, well, when we look at the irreconcilable speeches, we know that they were convincing, we know that they were dynamic speakers, but we don't have a lot of evidence to be able to point out that these speeches really convince people. And really, when we're looking at bringing the public along, do they really matter when you're talking about the ratification? Because the ratification is about the senators. I know the public can put pressure on the senators. The public can put pressure on Wilson. The public can put pressure on these guys. But at the same time, it really comes down to the political differences. So again, ways of really making sure that you point out the specifics of how evidence supports it. All right. Analyze the reasons why they failed to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. To analyze means to really break down the argument. So there's really two ways you can go about this. You can basically break down individual pieces of evidence, individual ideas, and just keep kind of going what they point to. Going through some of the events, going through some of the treaty itself and the articles that they disagreed with, and saying, well, this points to it being a difference of opinion. However, many of the arguments show that it was a power grab between the Senate and the President. Had Wilson possibly said, okay, the Senate gets to appoint this person, would that have alleviated the fears? Or was it just this isolationist tradition or this idea that the United States should really act on its own and be its own nation and not be tied down to a league. And so just really breaking down the individual pieces, or you can break it down and set arguments like we have so far. I would really just kind of maybe challenge some of the things that we haven't always looked at with the isolation tradition, looking at whether it's ideological or the different things in the treaty. But I think it's important to make sure you examine the issues in the treaty either way, because I think that that really shows a depth of knowledge, and it also allows you to really argue this. Remember, you can use knock and link as part of your analysis. Just make sure you evaluate their arguments rather than just state them. Thesis, again, if-thens work best for analyzing because they set up, here's what I'm going to analyze, here's what I'm going to break down, and really going into how this is how I'm going to break it down. I'm only going to do one of the Canada prompts. I think either way, like if we're talking about for what reasons and in what ways did Canada participate or in World War I, breaking down the reasons for why did they participate so heavily. Was this did they feel like they needed to prove themselves to Great Britain? Was Borden trying to justify or to prove Canada's worth to the Empire? I think by the end you see Borden really, at first, a real imperialist wanting to push forward. And then I think you see Borden get really disillusioned with Great Britain, with the idea of just how poor their planning was, how nearsighted their strategy was, and that really by pushing for the Canadian Corps to be separate, he allowed Canada to come up with its own strategies and be a much more efficient fighting force. And at the same time, when he was abroad as part of the Imperial Cabinet, it left Canada kind of leaderless. So I think some of the issues here, Borden just being really disillusioned with Great Britain and the Imperial, might have led him to push for more independence. But either way, I think when you look at the ways, you really need to focus on the military and the economic ways in which Canada participated, and you need to weave in that because of Borden's promise, because of the way they went after the war, with so heavily committing their troops and their economy and their going into so much debt, that they overextended their economy, that they basically alienated a whole minority group in their society. So I think there's a lot that you can kind of attack when you're looking at Canada. For this question in particular, I think for this prompt it is important to decide whether World War I birthed a nation, which is a traditional view, or did World War I divide a nation? And I think that argument you can use for either of the questions. What was the purpose of World War I? And what was the impact of it? I think when we look at politically, we could say it moved Canada forward from a place of patronage to a place of much more developed and political ideas, where you had political parties that were pushing how Canada should be run, farmers, laborers, all these different people going to the government as a way of making change. And I think you also see politically that Canada gets rid of Sam Hughes and his kind of the corruption that comes with patronage. And I think you see that throughout the world politically. I think you can also look at the advantages of having a nation of where women are voting at the end and these types of things. At the same time, you look at it and you go, well, why did Borden pass the War Elections Act that was so blatantly undemocratic in basically rigging the election? And so that's a place where maybe Canada didn't grow politically. And then when you look at how much did Canada, I mean, you could really say that Canada was politically divided at the end of the war. Economically, you could say that they grew industrial-wise and they were becoming a great economy, and yet at the same time you see them fade. The farming gets overextended and farmers struggle as the price drops throughout the 20s. And so there's many different ways. I think you could also break down Borden's promise. Did it help to create a nation, or did it harm the political economic future of the nation? I think thesis-wise, however you want to attack this, if then, or taking one of those two big ideas up there and doing a however. So I think really what's important here is that you kind of develop the way that you think about it. And I know that sometimes we want the teacher to say, here's the thesis I would use, here's the ideas I would use. And I've tried to really keep from doing that, because I find that when you can figure out your thesis statement, when you can figure out what you want to say, things click for you. And when I give it to you, I think you still will struggle with making sure it all clicks. So don't give up when your first draft isn't very good. Walk away from it. Come back. Sit down. Really attack the thesis and really make the draft of it stronger and stronger and stronger. Because as you do that, it will become easier and easier to develop these thesis statements. You guys know this stuff. You know it really well. So I expect to see that in the time rights. So good luck, and I wish you well. And yeah, good night.